Good evening. My name is Matthew Delapaz, and I will be talking about the effects of prolonged stress among educators. The purpose of this study was to investigate whether the stress experienced by educators over the course of many years caused physical signs of aging, something we often attribute to only time, but the possibility of being influenced by profession-related stress. We already know that chronic stress contributes to emotional burnout, depression, and anxiety, but stress also can have effects on the body on a cellular level. When the body is under stress, it produces cortisol, a hormone that breaks down collagen and elastin in the skin. These proteins are what keep the skin firm and smooth. Over time, elevated cortisol levels can result in visible signs of aging, like wrinkles, sagging, and uneven pigmentation. Stress also disrupts melanin production in hair, which can cause premature graying. The idea for this project actually started during a conversation I had with a teacher. We were talking about how different US presidents are affected from before and after during the presidential term. That led to a deeper discussion about stress in general and how there could be a correlation between physical aging and occupational stress. It made me to start to think, if leadership roles like presidency come with that kind of physical toll, what about other occupations like teaching? My research builds off several existing studies from both educational and medical fields. First, a study titled Occupational Stress of Anesthesia compared high-stress and low-stress medical professionals. Anesthesiologists who experience prolonged occupational stress showed more signs of visible aging. This connection between stress and physical aging in a demanding profession provided a strong scientific foundation for my study. I also examined stress, burnout, anxiety, and depression among teachers. A study found in the Library of Medicine, which reviewed over 143,000 educators globally. It identified core stressors like student behavior, class size, school climate, and a lack of support. This was helpful because chronic stress can evolve into burnout and depression, which opens up the door to educators also experiencing physical impacts. I also reviewed how much stress are presidents under, a study using face recognition software to analyze visible aging in US presidents during their time in office. This influenced my method to quantify physical stress indicators by using a photographic analysis. My methodology heavily reflects the systematic analysis that was done in this study. Ultimately, these studies were insightful, but a clear gap emerged. While there's extensive research on the psychological impacts of stress on educators, as well as visible signs of aging in other high-stress professions, there's little to no research exploring whether the same association between stress and aging applies to teachers. My research aims to fill this gap by exploring the potential correlation between the two. This brings us to my central question: to what extent do the visible signs of aging, including wrinkle depth, skin tone changes, and hair color variations in long-term educators, correlate with stressors from the teaching profession? Given the demands of teaching, as well as the scientific context and research that exists already, it is hypothesized that there's a strong correlation between occupational stress and the visible signs of aging in educators. Before I go any farther, one might ask, why do we care? This research matters because it brings awareness to the personal cost that long-term stress might have on the very people that are shaping our generations. If educators are physically impacted by the pressures of their profession, then that's not just a personal issue, it's a systematic one. Understanding how stress impacts those in important positions like teaching help us advocate for better healthier working conditions, better support systems, and ultimately a greater respect for the emotional and physical demands of the teaching profession. Now, first I must address a couple of key terms. Thematic analysis. It's a method used in qualitative research to identify and analyze patterns or themes within an interview data. Composite stress score. Composite stress score is a total score combining multiple stress indicators, in my case frequency, duration, and emotional intensity, which I'll get into later, which reflects an overall stress level. And then correlation coefficient, or also known as R-value. This is a number between -1 and 1 that shows the strength and direction of a relationship between two variables. To collect my data, I used a mixed methods approach of qualitative and quantitative data. This approach aims to give me all the data I need to attack my question from multiple different angles. Let's look at it a little bit deeper. For my qualitative data, I conducted one-on-one interviews with 30 long-term high school educators at a private high school in Florida, each with at least 7 years of experience. Each interview was audio recorded using my phone to allow me to go back and listen to the interviews. Prior to each interview, participants signed an AP Research consent form for human subjects per the College Board guidelines. During these interviews, I asked 15 open-ended questions designed to figure out the stressors they face in their profession, such as student behavior, workload, administrative demands, and personal life-related stress, etc. To convert my qualitative data from the interviews into a usable data set, I used a 3-part rubric. Each stressor was scored based on how frequently it was mentioned, how long it was discussed, and how intense the participant's description was. Each factor was scored on a 1 to 5 scale to be combined to make a final stress score between 3 and 15. This approach of converting interview responses into measurable scores is a common method in qualitative research. I modeled my rubric after Braun and Clark's 2006 project on thematic analysis, where they basically outlined how qualitative data like interviews can be analyzed for patterns and translated into numbers of scoring systems. It's so researchers can turn qualitative data into a useful comparative data set. In addition to the interview data, I collected photographs from the participants. All photographs were faculty portrait pictures sourced from this year's yearbook drive. It's important to note that I did not have early career photos for the participants, as the goal was not to measure change over time, but rather to assess the aging markers at the time of the study. Each image was analyzed using aging scales and then compared against participants' reported stress scores from the interviews. The tools I used were the Glo-Gu scale, which assessed wrinkle depth, the Fitzpatrick scale to assess possible skin damage or pigment change, and a hair coloring percentage chart. The results were compelling. Out of the 30 participants that I interviewed, 26 received a composite stress score of 10 or higher, placing them in a high stress category based on the rubric. The remaining 4 fell into the low stress category. The most commonly reported stressors were student behavior, which were reported by 24 participants, administrative demands, which was reported by 19, workload, which was reported by 14, and then personal life stress or pregnancy, which was reported by 12. When asked whether they noticed physical signs of aging throughout their careers, 24 of the participants responded with yes. Of those, 15 directly attributed those changes of stress to their profession. After converting all the data from the interviews and calculating each participant's composite stress score, I compared these numbers to their visible aging data. Participants with high composite stress scores, which was more than 10, showed noticeably higher physical aging indicators than those in the low stress group. For example, the average hair graying percentage in the high stress group was approximately 53%, compared to the 28% in the low stress group. The average wrinkle score among the high stress participants was a 2.3, while the average among the low stress participants was a 1.1. The most common skin type among the high stress participants was a type 3 or 4, while in the low stress, which associated with more visible damage compared to the low stress group, which reported type 1 or 2 skin. To get a better understanding of how strongly each aging factor was associated with stress, I calculated the correlation coefficient, or the R value, for each variable. The graph ranges from -1 to 1, where 0 means no relationship, and the values closer to 1 or -1 showed us stronger relationships. To calculate this, I took the composite stress score of each of the variables, which were converted to a number, and then I used Pearson's correlation coefficient to evaluate the relationships. So the results were that the wrinkle score and stress had an R value of 0.43, showing a moderate positive correlation, meaning that as stress increased, wrinkle severity tended to increase as well. Hair graying percent and stress had an R value of 0.41, which was also a moderate correlation, suggesting a similar trend. The strongest relationship of the three was skin damage and stress with an R value of 0.61, which is considered a strong positive correlation. Overall, all three aging factors supported my hypothesis, but as you can see here, skin damage or discoloration was the most strongly correlated with the stress in this sample. It's important to note that while correlation doesn't imply causation, these findings do point to a meaningful association between chronic professional stress and visible signs of aging. While this study provided insight into how stress may be linked to visible signs of aging in long-term educators, several limitations must be acknowledged. First, the sample size and method had challenges. I worked with only 30 participants from one private high school in Florida, which may not reflect broader teaching populations. This convenient sample introduces and limits generalizability. Larger, more diverse samples are needed for broader conclusions. Second, I lacked before images, so I couldn't measure aging over time, and I had to compare current physical markers across, and I couldn't compare current physical markers across participants with varying stress levels. A longer study would have provided clearer insight to individual change. Third, all stress data came from self-reports, which introduces subjectivity. Even with a consistent rubric, personal perception and memory could influence the results. Also, while I used validated scales as the aging indicators, my visual analysis wasn't conducted by a medical professional. It was conducted by me, which may have limited accuracy, even though I applied the tools as objectively as possible. And then lastly, the confounding variables like genetics, diet, and lifestyle were reported but not controlled for. These could influence aging independently of stress, complicating the significance of the results. In addition to the limitations beyond my control, I also had delimitations. First, I chose a study on high school educators. Including all grade levels would have increased variability and be required for a larger sample. Second, I included only teachers with 7 years of experience or more, targeting those likely to have experienced long-term occupational stress rather than focusing on earlier career challenges. Third, I limited the study to just 3 aging markers: wrinkles, skin condition, and hair graying, since they can be consistently evaluated through photographs and have established tools to calculate them. I also only used faculty portraits rather than attempting to gather earlier career photographs. While this limited my ability to track personal change over time, it allowed for a more consistent analysis across participants. Lastly, I worked with a single school chosen for accessibility and time constraints. This helped maintain consistency and build trust with the participants while allowing a more in-depth data collection. This research opens up the door for future studies and real-world impact. While my project was just a starting point, there's a lot more to look into. One major next step would be a more extended study, tracking teachers over time with photos, stress assessments, and even biometric data that would let researchers see actual change and not just self-reported experiences. Adding clinical measures like cortisol levels and telomere length would also help show stress effects to the body more scientifically. Lastly, it would also be useful to expand the demographics. My study stayed in just one private school. Future research could compare public versus private schools or even different professions to see how stress-related aging shows up across different demographics. This research could be useful to several groups. School administrators and policymakers might use it to support better mental health resources, stress reduction programs, or workload changes. Teacher advocacy groups could use the findings to push for better working conditions and retirement policies. My research helps fill the gap in the academic conversation by looking at something we don't usually think about: how teacher stress might actually show up physically. There's a lot out there on burnout and mental health, but not much on the stress that affects someone's appearance. By focusing on things like wrinkles, skin damage, and hair graying, I try to bring a new angle to the bigger conversation about stress and what it really does to people in this profession. These are my sources. Thank you.
Matt, how did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing the new understanding?
So when I was collecting data through the interviews, some of the questions I asked, I was able to convert the answers to quantitative data, but not all of them were. So that data that I collected from the interviews were harder to use because I wasn't able to find that correlation between the stress and the interview data. And then also some of the questions I asked were not exactly completely relevant to my question, to answering my research question.
How do your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
So my study really showed the correlation between educators and occupational stress. And so while it just scratched the surface, it does open up the door to further research. Researchers could definitely expand the demographics because I stayed in a small private high school. And so it was very specific, but if they expand the demographics, they can also study that. Also, it opens up the door to maybe other occupations that can be studied and see how stress can relate to physical aging in other occupations.
If you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
So I would have definitely expanded my demographics. I wish that I did go to another school, possibly, because I stayed in a private high school. My sample was very convenient, so therefore it introduced less variability. Thank you.